introduce our first speaker, is Victoria Brittain. Victoria's had a long and very distinguished career, including as a young girl reporting from Vietnam. She then moved on to report from Asia and the Middle East. She wrote for The Guardian and many French magazines. She's been Associate Foreign Editor of The Guardian and a UN consultant on the effect of war on women. She's written 2 plays, one on Guantanamo Bay and one entitled The Meaning of Waiting, portraying the lives of women caught up in war and terror. She's an author of many books, her latest being Shadow Lives, The Forgotten Women of the War on Terror, is on sale this evening and she'll be signing copies. Okay, Victoria.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Sheila, and for organising it in such an amazing way. I've never been to a meeting where there was music in the background and all these fabulous slides and everything, not to say all the meticulous fetching from trains and so on. So, very warm thank you to you, and thank you everybody for coming. Am I audible at the back?
Yes.
I'm not.
Yes, that means yes. Thumbs up.
Is that the one person who cannot hear me?
Oh, yes, you can.
Oh, you're saying you can, sorry. Good, excellent. If at any time I become inaudible, please just interrupt me if my voice drops. Okay, well that's a pretty hard act to follow. In a way, he's encapsulated a good deal of what I wanted to say, but I'm going to say it in my more pedestrian way. And the title confected for me by Sheila was The War on Terror, Lies, Truth and Propaganda. Of course, the War on Terror and the War of Iraq, which we're remembering 10 years ago, both started with lies and have depended on propaganda to sustain them, to sustain the kind of slightly uneasy political consensus ever since. I just want to remind us of some of the more iconic moments of lies. Colin Powell at the UN talking about uranium sales from Niger to Iraq, which never happened. Blair and the 45 minutes, which we had both with Heskett's piece and here. The killing of Jean-Charles de Menendez, branded as a terrorist by the Metropolitan Police. And our old friend, the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, who assured Parliament and the nation several times that Diego Garcia had never been used for rendition flights. Well, at the time, we in the anti-war movement ridiculed all these things, but the establishment and the media managed to make them credible so that most people believed that our security depended on these kind of things that they were being told. I'm sure that in Frome, 10 years ago, you had the most fabulous mobilization against the war in Iraq. And remember the worldwide demonstrations on the 15th of February. And of course at the UN we had the wonderful, elegant French Foreign Minister, Dominique de Villepin, calmly telling the Americans that no, it wasn't possible to pass a second resolution. And we had the wonderful Hans Blick saying, I'm inspecting the weapons and I need more time because I'm not finding any weapons. And I think that many of us got caught up in the sort of confidence of, we're going to stop it. Looking back now, it reminds me of some moments in the 60s and the mobilization against the Vietnam War. Of course, that was another one started on a lie. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, that never happened. And I remember this, again, the massive demonstrations and the intellectual force of Chomsky and the Berrigans and Dr. Spock all going to jail. And it took a very long time, and 55,000 American boys dead before that got stopped. And at the same time, then you had John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson going on with these wars for their own political reasons at home. They couldn't be soft on communists. Similarly, of course, Blair and Bush couldn't be soft on the dictator, although actually, as those wonderful photographs of Rumsfeld embracing Saddam Hussein remind us, they were best friends just a wee while before. I want to give you a tiny quote from the very wonderful former New York Times columnist Sidney Scharnberg, who was a journalist in Vietnam. And when the Gulf War started, he warned journalists not to forget what he called our unquestioning chorus of agreeability when Lyndon Johnson bamboozled us with his fabrication of the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, there we were with our Bush and our Blair and their wonderful friends in the media bamboozling us 10 years later. And if you remember some of it, do you remember when Bush actually lobbied Jacques Chirac to talk to him about Gog and Magog and the fact that God had specially ordained that this war should be fought in the Middle East? It was the quote from Bush was, the war has been willed by God, who wants to use this conflict to erase his people's enemy before a new age begins. I mean, even Heathcote could not make this stuff up. It's so mad. But nonetheless, where were the public denunciations? Not very many. And the pretense that the war was some kind of retaliation for 9/11, or it was about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, and it was about our safety. And you have to ask yourself, looking back on it, how on earth did they get away with it? Well, I think there are 4 reasons. Spineless government and parliament, a media that simply didn't do its job, this using of fear as a tool to make people agree with what people in power are doing. It's a very old story. And fourthly, the complicity of a very large number of governments. And very recently there's been a report from the Open Society which tells us that 54 governments were complicit in the rendition and torture program. 54 governments. I don't want to go in too much, and I'm sure the others will, into the 10 years toll from the US wars in which we were a partner. Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen. But the catalogue of lost lives, lost livelihoods, lost cultures, the poverty, the despair that we were all responsible for, is something that is so massive, it's very hard to take in, and it's completely impossible to try to convey it. And of course, what we've lost here too, and I'm going to come back to this later, as a result of all this, has been the incredible rollback of our civil liberties. When we think about Paul Bremer, remember Paul Bremer, a complete ignoramus, who was brought in by the Americans, who dismantled the Ba'ath Party, who allowed the large-scale looting of Iraq and set the scene for the catastrophe that is still Iraq today. How could it be that in America there was no outrage against this person? There wasn't. Of course, people wrote books afterwards, which were bestsellers, and people said, tut tut, how completely shocking. But nothing was done at the time. And look at Afghanistan. Do you remember when Sherry Blair and Laura Bush suddenly discovered that the women of Afghanistan were going to be freed by our soldiers going in? Again, you know, it's beyond parody. But again, you know, the media kind of wrote it down. But I just want to, before I completely dump on the media, I want to just remind us that there are some great journalists who've done the alternative narrative throughout. And I think, of course, of Patrick Coburn, of John Pilger, and, of course, of all the Arabic channels that valiantly gave a kind of counter-narrative throughout. And then we had WikiLeaks, the 2 iconic pieces of footage from WikiLeaks. First of all, the one killing the 2 Reuters journalists and 12 other people on the street in Baghdad. And the video footage and audio has the the people in the helicopter laughing and saying, let's give him another one, and laughing while they were doing it. And then the second one was the terrible massacre of more than 100 civilians at Garani in Afghanistan. But these were very small voices against the power of mainstream. Now, the tentacles of this war have gone so much further than all those places that I've mentioned. And everywhere, the story of lies and successful propaganda is essentially the same. And I want to turn now to 5 different kinds of war made in the United States, supported, of course, by us. And we know far too little about them. But the propaganda, that little that we do know, presents them as absolutely vital to our society. And here are the 5. Drones, killing from thousands of miles away, so no loss of American lives, only profits for the American companies which make the drones, and deaths for the individuals targeted by the United States President himself. Secondly, the use of private US contractors, as in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. They do the fighting, they make their own rules, and again, they make massive profits for companies like our old friends G4S and Blackwater. Thirdly is proxy wars, as in Somalia, where you get poor soldiers from poor countries to do the fighting and the dying. That's what we're seeing in West Africa now. Then there are the preparations for war, as in there were 170 bilateral and multilateral US military and naval exercises in Asia alone last year. Lastly, and even less visible, is cyber war, as in the US and Israeli war on Iran, or the current US-China skirmishing